Hey there, welcome to today's episode. And as you can see, we are diving in and taking a look at this sector application. I'm going to be doing a live unedited session, and there are going to be more and more of these on my channel for the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months. That's because I've just become a dad for the first time, so I have a newborn daughter. And in the evenings, I want to be supporting my partner, doing nappy changes and, feeds, not doing a bunch of video editing for 4 hours. So I'm just going to be doing more content like this where we can turn the camera on, pick a subject, and just talk about it and, dive in, make some beats, whatever it is. I'll also try and do some more live streams because that's another thing that I can do quite easily without it eating into too much of my time. So we are looking at how to manipulate audio loops, whether it's kind of melodic samples or vinyl samples or drum loops, whatever it happens to be. We can use this application here called Sector to do it. Unfortunately, it's only for iPad users, so you need some kind of iPad, but it is an older application, hasn't been updated in a while, but it's very stable and it seems to work on my really old iPad, and it works on this newer M2 chip iPad Pro. So I think you're okay with this one. It costs about £9 from the UK App Store, and it's been out for a good few years. I only discovered it because I was looking for a way to manipulate audio in real time so that it feels a bit more like painting, a bit more like experimenting. The process of beat making can be quite stale sometimes, particularly if you do it day in and day out. You bring in your loops, you're programming beats, you're chopping samples. I wanted something that felt more tactile and that we can kind of work with in sort of real time. So this is what I stumbled across. It's called Sector. The reason it is called Sector is because it is a loop player. Plays any kind of audio file, doesn't really need to be a loop, although loops work the best, and you'll see why, of course, as we go through. But it splits that loop into sectors, and those sectors can be manipulated in a bunch of really creative ways. So let's take a look at the user interface. You start off with the loop, this big donut, if you will. The different colored pieces are your sectors. By default, there are 16 of those, which can be changed, and we'll look at that later on. When you load up a project, you can choose a demo. So there's a bunch of demo projects. Let's just switch one out just so you can see what happens. This is demo number 5. Changes the BPM. Don't worry about all of these weird lines and connections. We'll talk about all of that in a second. But you can use the default projects. There's a bunch of sounds, loops, stuff that you can dive into. But really what I wanted it for was to bring in my own samples. And that's the really great thing about this, is that it lets you bring in your own loops. Doesn't seem to be a huge limitation on loop size either. So, it could be a 1-bar loop all the way up. I think I've done like 16, maybe even 32-bar loops just to see what happened. No real problems with this thing running. But keep that in mind so you can bring your own stuff in. The project menu has the usual options. So you can load one of the demo projects, we can save our project, or we can start a new one. Also, bearing in mind, there are some MIDI config because this is MIDI mappable, which is really good for doing like real time, manipulation. We're going to start with a new project. It's actually going to go back to just how we had it before. The interesting thing is that even though it's a blank project, it actually puts some sound in here for us. There is a drum loop if I play that. And you'll notice it just plays the loop all the way around, starting at 3 o'clock, comes all the way back around. It's 124 BPM is the sort of default tempo project. It certainly is on my particular application. Maybe yours would be slightly different. I'm not sure. Maybe I've opened this up and saved it in a weird state or something. But that's what it is at the moment. Doesn't really matter. We want to go to sound and we want to bring in our own loop. We can load samples. So if I load samples, I can see other samples that are in the built-in library. We've got recordings, so you can record on this, and we'll talk about that more later. But I can import audio. And if you've got audio share enabled, I'm going to use that. Or you can copy and paste audio in here. So I'm going to do that. I've created a drum loop at 80 BPM, something nice and simple so that it's easy to show what the application is doing. We're going to import that into the app, and we now have our new loop in here. But you'll notice it hasn't changed the tempo. So we're still playing our new loop at 124 BPM, and it's not time stretching that loop. It is just speeding it up to match the tempo of the project. If I go to sound and I go to speed and I click this, it goes back to 1, resets it to the default, and it is now 80 BPM as we want. The next thing to notice is that you can time stretch though, which is pretty cool. So if you have your loop playing around like this, I can choose this little link chain icon here. And you'll notice it says unlinked play rate. that unlocks time stretching in a way. So if we play the loop now and change this playback rate, listen to the loop. You can hear we are time stretching that loop, so we're changing the pitch and the speed of it whilst maintaining our 80 BPM. I'm going to re-click this and just put it back to normal for now, but have that in mind that you can do that. A couple of other things on the user interface. We have the volume control, a little window to see the waveform, a little window here showing us our loop, a couple of other bits of information. We have a record button, so you want to mangle your loop, you save some presets, whatever it is you want to do. You're going to want to be able to record that. Maybe you want to do a bit of like a live performance with this thing. You can do that and record it, and then you can export the audio out. These two little arrows here will reset our record, sort of like our recording option back to the beginning. So you want to record for like 1 bar, 2 bars, whatever. You can see that here. Run is the play button, as we've already discovered. And we also have these trigger buttons here. So if I press these, you can see that we're triggering different sectors around. If you want to change those to trigger different sectors, you just hold them down and then you press the appropriate sector. You'll notice they are color coordinated, so that has now changed to blue. Lets me know I'm triggering this one. And this is MIDI mappable, so it's going to be very, very useful when you want to do live performance stuff and just, be bouncing around, because this loop can be playing in real time and you can be triggering off and starting from other points and just getting some really creative, interesting effects. So we have that. The top left-hand corner has our modes for manipulating, our main modes for manipulating our loops. We have mapping, sequencing, and warping. That corresponds to the bottom left corner here, where we have mapping, sequencing, and warping, and we have our presets. So you can mangle a loop up. That will be saved on 1. If I move over to 2, it will reset, and I can mangle that loop again and have that saved as a preset. And all of these I can bounce around between in real time, again, whilst recording. So again, really good for just crazy loop mangling and stuff like that. You get 4 presets for each of the varying sort of options that you have. So we've got 4 presets that we can save for mapping, 4 for sequencing, and 4 for warping. Now that we've got that set up, a couple of things here. The sequence and the sector that you are manipulating, shall we say, will be the one that is lit up, and you can kind of see it puts like a little fade on the screen there. Hopefully that's visible, but also it lights up to tell you which segment that you're playing with. That is important because once you start doing a bunch of things in here, the user interface can get quite busy and you might not be sure exactly what you're messing around with, but just check for whichever segment is lit up. In order to simplify the process and talk about what each of these modes does, let's take a look at the fact that we can change our sectors as well. So by default, you have 16, but I can come in here and I can change that to something else. I can go to a maximum of 32. If we do 32 and we click OK, just keep in mind your connections, things that you mess around with, will be cleared if you change the sector amount. But if we do 32, it is now exactly the same loop, but it is split into 32 pieces of audio. That's an important thing as well, because you might want to match the amount of sectors you have to whatever piece of audio you've got. In this case, it's a very simple drum loop at 80 BPM. So a lot of these sectors are kind of useless because they will just be kind of very minimal audio or no audio at all. So it might be better to reduce this down and simplify it. And actually, for the purposes of showing you how the first section works, mapping, it's going to be better to reduce it anyway. So we'll go back to sectors, and I think we'll take this thing down to, I don't know, something like 8 sectors, maybe. Let's try 8. We can audition by clicking. So I can see kick drum, hi-hat, snare, and so forth. So 8 sectors for this particular loop works really well. But if you had a full melodic sample and you split that by 32 sectors and then you mess around with it, that might be something like really creative and really fun. And that might kind of suit that particular loop more. So just keep that in mind. For this one, I think 8 segments will work. Simplifying the view here is going to be easier as well for me to show you mapping. The first thing we need to look at are these little icons, these connections. These are what mapping is all about, really. It is the ability to have it play out of order. So at the moment, it starts at 3 o'clock and it plays through. And each of these, I'll zoom in post, so hopefully you can see these arrowheads, shows you the direction. So one sector is just linked to the next sector, all the way around. Makes perfect sense. But to be creative, maybe you want to bounce from, say, this first one, our kick drum, to something like the snare drum, and we want to skip a step. We can actually tell the application to do that. And the way that you do that is you select the first sector that you want, and then you need to select your second one. But rather than pressing it, what you do is you slide your finger on the sector. And what you'll notice is that we get this pie chart. And that is the probability, is the amount of chance that that is going to bounce over. So this application uses a lot of probability, which makes it really fun, because then you can set, a very small amount, so it's only going to trigger every once in a while, or you can crank it up to full and it's going to trigger like every time. You've got full control over that. Hopefully what you noticed is that it created this connection arrow and the little arrowhead showing that we've created a connection from our red sector here to our green sector. Really handy stuff. And the pie chart shows us how likely that is to trigger. The more green is, of course, the more likely that it is to trigger. So I'm going to leave it relatively high. Let's just play the loop round and watch how many times it triggers and skips a step. So you can see that skipping, it's using probability to jump between the sectors. And that really is what mapping is all about. It's just about creating jumps, to skip steps, to move between slices. You think about that as like an audio loop, something, and a sample, a vinyl sample from a record. It's the same as slicing it in your sampler. But maybe you just want to randomize that process. You want to let the hardware do the deciding of where it's just going to skip to and give you this completely organic feel for jumping between. Let's say you brought in, I don't know, something quite jazzy, like a lo-fi thing, a bunch of like horn samples. Could sound really cool if it was just firing between all of those. Lots of creative possibilities here. When we press each section to change, so between mapping, sequencing, and warping, you get these buttons underneath. They change ever so slightly depending on what you're playing around with. And what they do is just add in these connections here. So like this is where we started. We made one connection over. If I want to clear that, I can press clear. Keep in mind as well that the color of the sector that you're adjusting is linked to the color here. So with the red ones, we know that's what we're playing around with. I want to clear all of those connections. I just want to go back to the beginning. If I chose, say, something like my green here, and that's where I was going to start and make some connections, you'll notice it's changed to green on the buttons. And I could send one connection to all other sectors by pressing all. You'll notice it does that. Or I can clear. I can randomize them. And if you keep hitting random, it's going to give you a different random connection every time. We can clear them again. If we do all, we can actually shift, and it will shift back a segment. You can see it there. See the way it's moved from green over? You can shift it around. Another fun way of playing with things. All of which can be manipulated in real time. And that goes the other way. We can shift forward. We can also just flip, so we can flip from one side, flip to the other. Now, I want to clear them out. I want to clear any connections that I've got in here. I just want to quickly make sure that we've cleared everything. And the reason for that is because every single one of these modes can be connected. It's not like you can only use one at a time. I can do my mapping and bounce around like we've just done here. Then I can go in and play with the sequencer. Then I can warp on top of that. So just so that we've got a clear playing field to see what each individual section does, we're going to clear this off so that the loop has no connections and it's playing as it should. So that is our first mode. Sequencing is the next one. And when you open this up, we get essentially a step sequencer, and you can have everything from one single step all the way to 64 steps. And you can increase that by just pressing this at the bottom in single individual steps. I'm actually going to reduce it down to say something like 16 steps to make life easier, make sure it's not so complicated on the screen. We have similar set of buttons. We choose a sector. So we know this is our kick drum. I put that in on the first step. Because it's like a step sequencer, nothing really will change. because that is exactly how the sequence begins. But what happens if we randomly throw a few more of these things in? You can see it bouncing back to that sector every time. And of course, we can choose a different sector and we can throw those in. Again, you can see the potential of how you can create a break. You can get that break to trigger in different orders. A vinyl sample, a loop, a melodic loop. You could have it trigger in all kinds of different ways, completely at random. The great thing about this as well is that we can use our tools. So we could clear all of those off using clear. I don't want any of those. If I click my red sector, I can clear that as well and just start all over again. I can randomize them. And you'll notice when I do random, it actually randomizes all of these, and it randomizes through every single step. So if you open this up further, all the way to 64 steps, it's actually populated all of those in there. I'm just going to quickly undo this for a second and take this one out. No, it doesn't work like that. That's the only one thing when you want to clear this thing out. I haven't found a very quick way really of doing this. You can just double click on the circles, as you can see I'm doing here. I'm just going to do it that way. Once it's randomized, because it's choosing everything. Otherwise, we'd have to choose each sector and then do clear. But, that's how you do it if you want to do it. We can do the same thing. Let's say we've got this one selected, put a few notes in. We can do it like this, and you can shift things around. We can move through the order. We can also reverse the order and do it that way as well, and we can clear out. The one last thing to talk about here is the probability, because at the moment, whenever you put this in and you've got a solid circle, it is always going to trigger that. So if we play, it's always going to trigger that. If we move that off kilter for a second, if we want to add some probability, we put our finger on here and we move it up and down. And that way, the smaller the circle is, the less likely it is to play. And the bigger it is, of course, all the way up to full, where it will definitely play each time. You get your probability. So if we set it, I don't know, maybe slightly more than 50%, let's just watch how many times it triggers. You can see that kicking in. So you've got probability here as well. And as I mentioned before, we can do our mapping. We can get all of that triggering with probability. We can then move on and still mess around with the sequencing as well. Get that working with probability, and then we can move on to our final step, which is our warping. So let's take a look at warping. Warping looks kind of visually the most busy on screen, but it's not as complicated as it kind of looks. It just kind of looks quite busy. What we have here are different playback modes for the sector. Now you'll notice as I press it here, I can audition that sample. I can also audition it here. And with a straight diagonal line like this, it plays back in completely a normal way. The only time it starts to differ is when we change the playback modes, and we've got all of these to choose from. We're not going to go through all of these. They all do something different. They distort and they manipulate the audio in some kind of way. So this is our kick drum. Regular. We try this one here with a kind of sort of bumped envelope. It's like a scratch. And you can see it loads it onto this particular circle in the middle here. So for each and every one of our sectors, you can have 4 different effects loaded on there. And these triggers in between. So let's go back. So the first one, that is just straight up. The next one here, it plays in a sort of warpy kind of way, like a record scratch. The next one, it's like a double. Let's change the last one here to, I don't know, like a triplet or something. Or, even quadruple. It's going to play quite quickly. What you'll notice is that currently with the sliders, as it loops around, it's going to play 100% with just regular. But we can then change the probability. So let's say every single time I actually want it to play this one 100%. You'll notice as I move that up, it makes it 50-50. If we get rid of this one, it's always going to give us our kind of like quadruple at the beginning. Nice and simple. As I reduce this down, that is just the probability for that one particular step. And it's great that as you bring all of these in, you get a calculated adjustment of all of them. So you can kind of set that. So you could have them all roughly about, not necessarily 50%, but there is a 20% chance for each particular effect to trigger as it comes around. So let's leave them all kind of roughly in the middle and just see as we play it around a few times, it should switch out the effect that is being played here. There you go. It's cycled through all of those. And as I said, depends on what percentage you have on each of these. You can set them so that none of them trigger, or you can set one individual particular effect to trigger 100% of the time and everything in between. So the probability is really, really cool. So that pretty much covers it for this. Again, just keep in mind that there are presets. So if we said this was what we wanted on one, let's just set this to 100%. Actually, let's set it so that it is triggering like the quadruple again at 100%. That could be my preset. That's the first thing that I want to happen here. But actually on the second preset, I want to change that up. I can move to number 2. You'll notice everything resets, including the effects. So we could set something else. Let's set it so that, I don't know, what's this one do? We got like this triangle shape. Gives us again like a sort of record scratch. That is now set as my preset number 2. Jump back over to my other preset with our quadruple that's going to be triggering. You get the idea. So between all of these 3 modes, you can just take any kind of audio loop that you want and just mash that thing into infinity. It is really powerful and really creative. As I said, it's a bit of an unusual app because it's pretty old. You may have heard of it already. Maybe you've already been using it. And it is a little bit of a shame that there's no Android version or any kind of future updates for it. But it is a very stable and, feature-filled application already. So I think that's probably why the developers have just said, you know what, it's good enough, it's working. You guys can run with it and do what you want. So those are the 3 modes. That is how you can take any audio loop, slice that thing into infinity with, a million possibilities. Record all of that out, export that audio out, play around in real time if you want, trigger this with a MIDI controller, and yeah, just go wild with your audio loops. Anyway, I've said enough about this. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.